What if one tiny island, not a capital city, not an aircraft carrier, and not even a military base became the single most valuable piece of territory in the Middle East? Not because millions of people live there, not because it holds a massive army, but because nearly an entire nation's economy depends on it. Imagine an island so strategically important that losing it even temporarily could cripple a country's finances almost overnight. Now imagine American Marines waiting just over the horizon, carrier strike groups maintaining constant patrols, reconnaissance aircraft flying day and night, while military planners quietly study one question: not whether they could seize the island, but whether they ever should. Because sometimes modern wars aren't decided by who has the larger army. They're decided by who controls the infrastructure that keeps an economy alive. And in this fictional strategic scenario, that infrastructure sits on a small coral island in the northern Persian Gulf. An island known as Karg Island, barely 5 miles long, easy to overlook on a map, yet responsible for moving almost all of Iran's crude oil exports to the outside world. For decades, military planners around the world have understood one simple reality: if global energy has an artery, Karg Island is one of the valves that keeps it flowing. Before we go any further, one important note: everything discussed in this video is presented as a fictional strategic scenario based on publicly known military capabilities, historical precedents, and open source analysis. It is not a report of real world events. The purpose is to explore how military planners might think through a hypothetical crisis, not to describe actual ongoing operations. With that established, let's examine why this island has become the center of so many strategic conversations. The latest developments began with renewed tensions around one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. According to this fictional scenario, two commercial tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz were struck by 1-way attack drones within less than 20 for hours. Neither incident involved major naval combat. Neither required fleets exchanging missiles. Yet both immediately changed the strategic picture. Because every commercial vessel attacked inside the Strait raises the same question: is global shipping still secure? Within hours, the United States answered. Not with a declaration of war, not with an invasion, but with precision airstrikes against coastal military infrastructure, radar stations, drone storage facilities, missile launch positions, surveillance networks overlooking the strait. The targets were carefully selected: military assets, not civilian infrastructure. The message was unmistakable: commercial shipping would continue, and attacks on that shipping would carry consequences. Iran responded in kind. Retaliatory strikes targeted positions linked to American forces elsewhere in the Gulf. Regional governments issued condemnations. Military alert levels increased. Naval patrols intensified. Suddenly, the ceasefire that had supposedly stabilized the region looked far less certain than it had only days before. From a distance, it appeared as though another war had suddenly erupted. But that's not actually what happened, because this crisis didn't begin with those drone strikes. Those attacks were only the latest chapter in a confrontation that had already been unfolding for months. To understand why events escalated so quickly, you have to rewind back to the beginning. Earlier in this fictional timeline, a large scale regional conflict fundamentally reshaped the balance of power across the Middle East. A coordinated air campaign severely damaged Iran's military infrastructure. Senior leadership figures were eliminated. Air defense networks suffered extensive losses. Naval facilities were struck. Strategic command centers were degraded. The objective wasn't occupation. It was to reduce Iran's ability to project conventional military power across the region. Tehran answered almost immediately. Missiles, drones, regional proxy forces, and perhaps most importantly, pressure on maritime traffic passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Because if Iran could no longer match its opponent's aircraft for aircraft, or carrier for carrier, it could still influence one of the world's most important shipping lanes. That changed the nature of the conflict completely. Instead of massive armored offensives, the struggle shifted toward economics. Energy, insurance markets, commercial shipping, global supply chains. The battlefield expanded far beyond military installations. Eventually, diplomats attempted to halt the fighting. A temporary memorandum established a 60-day framework intended to reduce hostilities. Commercial shipping would resume. Military activity would decrease. Negotiations would continue. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of agreement both sides needed. But agreements only matter if both sides interpret them the same way. And almost immediately, different interpretations began to emerge. Iran maintained that it retained authority over how vessels moved through the strait. The United States insisted that international navigation could not depend on Tehran's permission. Those two positions may sound similar. In reality, they represent completely different visions of who controls one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. One side viewed navigation as sovereign authority. The other viewed it as international freedom of movement. Neither position changed. The ceasefire simply paused the argument. It didn't resolve it. And that is why, only days later, commercial tankers were once again being attacked. Now here's where this story becomes far more important than another exchange of drone strikes. Because beneath every military operation, every diplomatic statement, and every headline about the Strait of Hormuz, sits one question that both sides have been trying to answer since this conflict began. Who ultimately controls the flow of energy out of the Persian Gulf? That question doesn't begin in open water. It begins on a single island, Karg Island. For decades, the island has served as the primary export hub for Iranian crude oil. Tankers arrive. Pipelines feed massive storage facilities. Oil is loaded around the clock before heading toward customers across Asia and beyond. In strategic terms, it's less like an ordinary island, and more like the main valve in an enormous pipeline. If that valve keeps operating, revenue continues flowing. If that valve stops, the consequences spread throughout the entire economy. Military planners have understood that reality for years, because geography can sometimes create vulnerabilities that no amount of military spending can completely eliminate. Most countries distribute critical infrastructure across multiple ports in multiple regions. Iran has far fewer options. Much of its coastline lacks the deep water facilities needed to handle the world's largest crude carriers. Karg's natural location makes it exceptionally valuable, which also makes it exceptionally vulnerable. That vulnerability has never gone unnoticed. Earlier in this fictional campaign, American aircraft conducted multiple precision strikes against military positions located on or around the island. Air defense batteries, missile storage areas, mine-lane facilities, command posts. Notice what those strikes avoided. The oil terminals themselves. That distinction was deliberate. The objective wasn't to destroy Iran's energy industry overnight. The objective was to reduce military capabilities while preserving room for diplomacy. Military pressure, without immediately triggering an economic shock that could spread far beyond the region. Because once energy infrastructure becomes the target, the consequences are no longer limited to the battlefield. Oil prices respond. Insurance premiums surge. Shipping companies recalculate risk. Governments thousands of miles away suddenly find themselves affected by decisions made inside the Persian Gulf. Modern wars rarely stay local for very long, especially when energy is involved. But Tehran understood something equally important. If Karg Island represents America's most obvious pressure point, then the Strait of Hormuz represents Iran's. One threatens exports, the other threatens transportation. Both sides possess leverage, just in very different forms. That's why neither government appears eager to push all the way to maximum escalation. Instead, both have spent months operating inside carefully managed limits. Iran applies pressure to commercial navigation. The United States answers with strikes on military infrastructure. Iran responds again. Washington answers again. The pattern repeats, not because either side lacks military capability, but because both understand that crossing certain thresholds could produce consequences neither actually wants. That helps explain another development that has attracted growing attention among defense analysts. Throughout this fictional scenario, the United States has maintained a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the region. At first glance, that might sound like just another deployment. It isn't. Marine Expeditionary Units exist for one specific purpose: rapid crisis response. Unlike conventional ground forces that require established bases, large logistics networks, and extended preparation, a Marine Expeditionary Unit can project combat power directly from the sea, within hours. Amphibious assault ships function almost like compact aircraft carriers. They carry infantry, attack helicopters, heavy lift aircraft, armored vehicles, logistics equipment, in short, take-off fifth-generation fighters capable of supporting operations ashore. Everything necessary for an initial operation travels together. Self-contained, noble, ready. That's exactly why these formations are often positioned near regions where uncertainty remains high. They don't necessarily signal that an invasion is coming. They signal that options remain available, and a military strategy. Options create leverage long before they're ever used. Recent deployments have only fueled that discussion further. Reports within this fictional scenario describe additional American ground forces moving into the broader Gulf region. combined with carrier strike groups, long Midas range bombers, air Midas defense systems, and persistent naval patrols. The overall posture suggests preparation for multiple contingencies, not commitment to one specific course of action. Military planners rarely prepare for only one possibility. They prepare for dozens. Everything from escorting commercial shipping, to missile defense, to limited amphibious raids, to larger regional operations if deterrence fails. Preparation does not guarantee action, but it changes how every opponent calculates risk. And that's exactly what deterrence is supposed to accomplish. This is why strategic discussions keep returning to Karg Island. Not because anyone expects a landing tomorrow, but because everyone understands what the island represents. It isn't simply a military objective. It's an economic center of gravity. A place where military strategy and national finance intersect. If shipping through Karg were interrupted, Iran could still produce oil, but exporting it would become dramatically more difficult. Revenue would fall. Foreign currency earnings would shrink. Pressure on the government would increase. From a purely strategic perspective, few locations offer that level of influence over an opponent's economy, which explains why the island remains at the center of so many military simulations, even when no operation is actually underway. And yet, there's another side to that equation, because taking an island and holding an island are two completely different missions. Karg sits only a short distance from the Iranian mainland, well within range of missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and coastal artillery. Any force stationed there would immediately become a fixed target. Unlike a destroyer, it couldn't simply reposition overnight. Everything, fuel, food, ammunition, medical supplies, would have to arrive by sea or air. Every resupply mission would itself become a military operation. Every convoy would require protection. Every helicopter flight would carry risk. That's why experienced military planners rarely view island occupations as simple victories. Capturing terrain is only the beginning. Sustaining it is often the harder challenge. And in the Persian Gulf, geography favors defenders just as much as attackers. That reality continues shaping every decision made on both sides. And that's exactly why either side appears willing to make the next move. At least, not yet. Because from Washington's perspective, Karg Island is far more valuable as leverage than as occupied territory. Think about it this way. If American forces were to seize the island, what would happen next? Iran would almost certainly lose access to its primary export terminal. But the United States wouldn't suddenly begin exporting Iranian oil. The island wouldn't magically become an American energy asset. Instead, Washington would inherit a completely different problem. Defending a small piece of land only a few dozen miles from Iran's coastline, day after day, week after week. Every supply ship entering the area would require escort. Every helicopter approaching the island would become a potential target. Every radar contact, every unidentified boat, every drone launch would demand an immediate response. That isn't just a military operation. It's a permanent commitment. And history has repeatedly shown that occupying strategic terrain is often much easier than holding it. Iran understands those risks just as well, which explains why its strategy has increasingly focused on asymmetric warfare. Not large naval battles, not carrier minus versus minus carrier confrontations. Instead, small attack drones, fast assault boats, sea mines, coastal missile batteries, electronic surveillance, commercial shipping harassment. These are comparatively inexpensive tools, but they force a much larger military to devote enormous resources to protection and escort operations. That's the logic behind asymmetric strategy. You don't have to defeat your opponent outright. You only have to make every victory more expensive than expected. And narrow waterways like the Strait of Hormuz naturally favor exactly that kind of approach. This is why every commercial tanker matters. To most people, a single damaged cargo ship may seem like a relatively minor incident. Strategically, it's anything but. Every successful attack immediately raises new questions. Will insurance premiums increase? Will shipping companies delay departures? Will oil traders begin pricing in additional disruption? Will governments request additional naval protection? One relatively inexpensive drone can create consequences measured in billions of dollars across global markets. That's why commercial shipping has remained such an important target throughout this fictional scenario. The objective isn't necessarily to sink large numbers of ships. It's to create uncertainty, because uncertainty itself becomes a strategic weapon. Markets dislike uncertainty. Shipping companies dislike uncertainty. Energy traders dislike uncertainty. Every additional layer of doubt increases economic pressure, and that's pressure that reaches far beyond the battlefield. Washington, meanwhile, appears focused on preventing exactly that uncertainty from becoming permanent, rather than attempting to eliminate every possible threat. An impossible task in any conflict, American strategy has centered on maintaining confidence and freedom of navigation. Destroyers patrol key sea lanes. Reconnaissance aircraft monitor activity around the clock. Carrier aviation provides rapid response capability. Marine forces remain positioned nearby. Together, these deployments create a visible security framework, not because every attack can be prevented, but because commercial operators must believe someone is capable of responding when attacks occur. Confidence is almost as important as capability, sometimes even more important, because global commerce depends as much on perception as it does on physical security. Yet beneath all the military movements, another battle is taking place. One that's fought not with missiles, but with time. Iran's economy continues operating under intense financial pressure. Years of sanctions, reduced investment, infrastructure damage, military rebuilding. All of it consumes resources. Every month spent under those conditions becomes increasingly expensive. The government therefore faces a difficult balancing act. Apply enough pressure to preserve leverage, but avoid triggering an overwhelming response. Washington faces its own balancing act. Maintain deterrence, protect commercial shipping, support regional partners, but avoid becoming trapped in another prolonged military commitment. Neither side has found a perfect solution. Instead, both continue managing escalation one incident at a time. And perhaps that's the most revealing aspect of this entire fictional scenario. Despite all the military deployments, despite the carrier strike groups, despite the drones, the missiles, the fighter aircraft, neither government appears eager to cross the final threshold, because once that threshold is crossed, control becomes much more difficult. Wars often begin according to carefully written plans. They rarely continue according to those plans. History offers countless examples. A limited strike becomes a regional conflict. A maritime incident expands into months of combat. An operation intended to strengthen deterrence instead produces wider escalation. Military planners understand those risks better than anyone, which is exactly why so much emphasis is placed on deterrence before fighting begins. If deterrence succeeds, the operation never has to happen. If it fails, events can move faster than diplomacy. That leaves Karg Island occupying a unique position in this entire strategic equation. It's more than an oil terminal, more than a military objective, more than a small island in the Persian Gulf. It has become a symbol of something much larger. The intersection of military power, economic survival, energy security, and geopolitical influence. Whoever can threaten that intersection gains leverage. Whoever can protect it preserves stability. And that's precisely why so many military analysts continue watching this island so closely. Not because it's the largest objective, but because it may be the most consequential one. As long as a current balance holds, Karg remains a bargaining chip. The moment that balance disappears, it could become the center of an entirely different phase of the conflict. So where does all of this leave the situation? Ironically, not at a moment of certainty, but at a moment of calculation. Because the real battle is no longer about who possesses the larger military. That question has largely been answered. The real battle is about endurance. Which side can maintain pressure longer, without triggering a conflict neither truly wants? That may sound contradictory, but history is filled with wars where both sides attempted to avoid full escalation while simultaneously refusing to back down. This fictional scenario appears to fit that pattern remarkably well. Look closely at what has actually happened. Commercial shipping continues moving through the Strait. Naval patrols remain active. Carrier strike groups stay on station. Diplomatic channels remain open. Military deployments remain elevated. In other words, neither peace nor war has fully taken hold. Instead, the region has entered something in between. A prolonged contest of deterrence. Every drone launch tests resolve. Every airstrike tests restraint. Every diplomatic meeting buys a little more time. And every passing week raises the same question. How long can that balance survive? That question matters because both governments are operating under very different pressures. For Tehran, time carries economic costs, while exports remain vulnerable. Foreign investment remains limited. Military rebuilding requires enormous resources. Domestic expectations continue growing. Maintaining leverage in the Strait offers one of the few remaining tools capable of influencing negotiations. From Washington's perspective, the priorities are different. Freedom of navigation, regional stability, alliance credibility, preventing the energy markets from entering another major shock. Those objectives don't necessarily require a wider war, but they do require demonstrating that attacks on commercial shipping will not become the new normal. That is why every response has been carefully measured, strong enough to reinforce deterrence, restrained enough to avoid triggering uncontrolled escalation. It's a difficult balance to maintain, and balances like this rarely remain stable forever. The Marine Expeditionary Unit sitting offshore perfectly illustrates that reality. Many people see amphibious assault ships and immediately assume invasion. Military planners often see something different. Flexibility. A Marine Expeditionary Unit represents options: humanitarian evacuation, embassy reinforcement, limited raids, protection of critical infrastructure, maritime security operations, or, if absolutely necessary, larger amphibious action. The value of such a force isn't simply what it can do. It's what every potential adversary knows it could do. Deterrence is strongest when capabilities are visible, but in use, because uncertainty affects decision-making on both sides. That is precisely why these forces remain deployed during periods of fragile stability. Meanwhile, Karg Island continues sitting quietly at the center of the entire equation. Day after day, tankers approach. Loading operations continue. Military surveillance remains constant. Everyone understands its importance. No one wants to become the first to fundamentally change its status. Because once energy infrastructure becomes the primary battlefield, the consequences spread far beyond the Gulf. Oil prices react. Financial markets react. Supply chains react. Governments thousands of miles away suddenly discover they have become participants in a crisis they never intended to join. That's the unique nature of strategic infrastructure. Its influence extends well beyond the territory it occupies. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson this fictional scenario offers. Modern conflicts are no longer decided solely by armored divisions crossing borders. Increasingly, they're shaped by logistics, energy, trade routes, communications, financial resilience, critical infrastructure. Military power still matters, but economic pressure often travels farther than missiles ever can. Sometimes, controlling the flow of resources creates more leverage than controlling territory itself. That's why islands like Karg appear again and again in strategic planning. Not because